In 1873, 17-year-old Margaret Rose Sinclair was sold by her own mother for 30 silver pieces, the price her family put on a daughter they deemed too ugly for anything better than ranch labor in the unforgiving Wyoming Territory. But when a gentle cowboy named Steady looked at her and saw something no one else ever had, Margaret would discover that true beauty isn't measured by a mirror's reflection. What happens when a heart learns its own worth for the very first time? Margaret's bare feet slapped against the cold wooden floor as she ran through the dark cabin, her heart beating like a wild bird trying to escape a cage. Behind her, angry voices grew louder, and she knew her life was about to change forever. $30 is my final offer, a gruff man's voice echoed from the main room. Take it or leave it. She pressed her back against the wall near the kitchen, trying to make herself small. Through a crack in the wooden boards, she could see her mother's worn hands shaking as she held the silver coins. The metal caught the firelight like tiny stars, but Margaret felt only darkness spreading through her chest. She's 17, her mother said quietly, strong as any boy, and she knows how to work hard. Margaret had always known she wasn't pretty. The other girls in Cheyenne had smooth faces and golden hair that curled just right. Their mothers braided ribbons into their locks and called them precious and beautiful. Margaret's mother never used those words. Instead, she would sigh when looking at Margaret's face and say things like, "Well, beauty isn't everything," or, "At least you have a good heart." The cabin felt smaller tonight than ever before. 3 rooms that had housed the Sinclair family for 8 years now seemed to press against Margaret's lungs like a tight corset. Her father had built these walls with his own hands before he died of fever 2 winters ago. Now her mother was selling his daughter like she might sell his old boots or his fishing rod. "The girl comes with clothes on her back and nothing more," Thomas Barrett continued. His voice sounded like gravel rolling down a hill. "I need someone to help my wife with cooking and cleaning. Ranch work is hard, and the men need their meals on time." Margaret touched the silver thimble in her pocket, the only thing her grandmother had left her before passing last spring. The metal felt warm against her fingers, like a tiny piece of love she could carry anywhere. Her grandmother had beautiful hands, soft and gentle, and she used to tell Margaret that true beauty came from kindness, not from what people saw on the outside. "What about schooling?" her mother asked, though her voice already sounded defeated. "No time for books on a ranch," Mr. Barrett replied. "But she'll have a roof over her head and 3 meals a day. That's more than most folks can promise these days." Margaret's stomach twisted into knots. She had loved school, especially when Mrs. Henderson read stories about brave girls who went on adventures. In those stories, the plain girls always turned out to be heroes. They saved kingdoms and married princes and proved that courage mattered more than a pretty face. But this wasn't a story. This was real life in the Wyoming Territory, where winter could kill you and pretty faces didn't matter if you couldn't work hard enough to survive. The sound of coins clinking together made Margaret's knees weak. 30 pieces of silver. She remembered that number from Sunday school, when Pastor Williams told the story of Judas betraying Jesus. The irony felt like a knife twisting in her heart. "It's settled then," Mr. Barrett said. "I'll come for her at dawn. Have her ready." Margaret heard heavy boots walking toward the door, and she quickly crept back to her small bedroom. She pulled out the wooden box where she kept her treasures, her father's old Bible with its cracked leather cover, a pressed wildflower her grandmother had given her, and a small mirror that showed her reflection all too clearly. Looking at herself now, Margaret saw what everyone else saw: auburn hair that never stayed neat, freckles scattered across pale skin like dirt on snow, and a nose that bent slightly to the left from when she fell out of the apple tree at age 10. Her brown eyes were her best feature, she thought, but even they couldn't make up for everything else that was wrong with her face. She wrapped her few belongings in an old quilt her grandmother had made. Each stitch told a story of love and patience, and Margaret wondered if she would ever feel that kind of love again. Her mother appeared in the doorway, looking older than her 35 years. "Margaret," she began. but her daughter held up a hand to stop her. "I heard everything," Margaret said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You sold me." Her mother's face crumpled like paper in the fire. "You don't understand. We're barely surviving here. Your brother needs medicine, and winter's coming fast. This way, you'll have a future." "A future as what?" "A servant." "A future as someone useful," her mother snapped, then immediately looked sorry for her harsh words. "I'm not good at this, Margaret. I never learned how to be the kind of mother who says pretty things and makes everything seem wonderful. But I know this: staying here will just make you bitter and old before your time. At least at the ranch, you'll learn skills that matter." Margaret wanted to argue, to fight, to scream that mothers weren't supposed to give up on their children, but she was tired of fighting a battle she could never win. She was tired of seeing disappointment in her mother's eyes every time she looked at her. Instead, she kissed her mother's cheek and whispered, "I hope you're right." As she lay in her small bed for the last time, listening to her mother cry in the next room, Margaret made a promise to herself. Whatever happened at the Barrett Ranch, she wouldn't let it break her spirit. She would work hard, keep her head high, and maybe, just maybe, find a place where being useful mattered more than being pretty. Outside, the September wind rattled the windows like fingers drumming on glass, and Margaret wondered if the sound was nature's way of saying goodbye. "Get up, girl. Time to go." Thomas Barrett's voice cut through Margaret's dreams like an axe through wood, dragging her back to the harsh reality of this September morning in 1873. She had barely slept, and now the sun wasn't even showing its face above the horizon. Margaret dressed quickly in her best dress, though best was a relative term when you only owned 3 dresses total. This one was blue cotton with tiny white flowers, and her mother had sewn it herself 2 years ago when Margaret still held on to hope that someone might notice her at the church socials. The main room felt different now, like a place she was visiting instead of home. Her mother stood by the stove, making breakfast with jerky movements that betrayed her nervousness. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, but Margaret's stomach was too twisted to feel hungry. "Eat something," her mother said without looking at her. "Long trip ahead." "How long?" Margaret asked, cutting her bacon into small pieces she didn't want. 3 days by wagon," Mr. Barrett answered from his seat at their small table. He looked bigger in their tiny cabin, like a bear sitting in a dollhouse. "We'll camp 2 nights, then reach the ranch by Thursday evening." 3 days alone with this stranger. Margaret studied his face, trying to read his character the way her father had taught her to read the weather. Mr. Barrett had deep lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and his hands were scarred from years of hard work. He didn't seem mean, exactly, but he didn't seem particularly kind either. He seemed practical, like a man who saw everything in terms of what needed doing. "My wife Eleanor will explain your duties," he continued. "We run a decent operation, no drinking, no gambling, no nonsense. You work hard, you eat well, and you earn your keep. Fair enough?" Margaret nodded, though fair seemed like a word that had lost all meaning in the last 12 hours. "What about letters?" her mother asked suddenly. "Can she write to us?" "If she has time," Mr. Barrett replied with a shrug. "Though I expect she'll be too busy to get homesick." The word homesick hit Margaret like a slap, as if missing the people who sold you was a luxury she couldn't afford. When it came time to leave, Margaret's goodbye with her mother lasted exactly 15 seconds. A quick hug, a whispered, "Be good," and then she was climbing into Mr. Barrett's wagon with her bundle of belongings clutched in her arms. Her younger brother, Jake, appeared at the last minute, running from the neighbor's house where he'd been staying. At 13, he was already taller than Margaret and handsome in a way that made girls giggle when he walked by. Their mother had never worried about Jake's future. "Maggie, wait," he called, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. He pressed something small and hard into her palm, a smooth river rock they'd found together last summer. "For luck," he said, his voice cracking. This goodbye hurt worse than her mother's distance. Jake had always been her ally, the one person who never seemed to notice that she wasn't pretty. He saw her as his big sister, who could climb higher trees and catch more fireflies than anyone else in Cheyenne. "Take care of yourself," she whispered, memorizing his face. The wagon lurched forward, and Margaret watched her family's cabin grow smaller until it disappeared behind a hill. She was leaving behind 17 years of life, 17 years of knowing exactly where she fit in the world, even if that place had always felt too small. Mr. Barrett wasn't much for conversation during the first day of travel. He pointed out landmarks occasionally, that's Crow Creek, or Antelope Country ahead. But mostly, he seemed content to let the horses set the pace while he chewed tobacco and spit into the dust. Margaret studied the landscape with new eyes. She'd lived her whole life in Cheyenne, but she'd never traveled far beyond its borders. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly in every direction, rolling hills covered in golden grass that bent and swayed like ocean waves. The sky seemed bigger here, wider somehow, as if God had taken a deep breath and expanded the heavens just for this wild country. They stopped for lunch beside a creek that bubbled over smooth stones. Mr. Barrett shared his jerky and hardtack without ceremony, treating her like a fellow traveler rather than purchased property. The gesture was small, but it made Margaret feel slightly more human. "You scared?" he asked suddenly, the first personal question he'd posed. Margaret considered lying, but something about the vast openness around them seemed to demand honesty. "Yes," she admitted. "Good," he replied, surprising her. "Means you got sense. Folks who aren't scared usually aren't paying attention." "Are you scared of anything?" she asked. Mr. Barrett was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, "Losing the ranch? We built it from nothing, my Eleanor and me. Came out here with 2 horses and a dream, and now we've got something worth protecting. But ranching's a hard business. Weather, market prices, cattle thieves, any of those things could wipe us out." It was the most he'd said all day, and Margaret realized he was telling her something important. He wasn't just a man who bought girls from their mothers. He was someone fighting his own battles, trying to build something lasting in a place where nothing came easy. That evening they made camp beside a grove of cottonwood trees. Mr. Barrett built a fire with efficient movements, while Margaret gathered wood and helped prepare their simple meal. The work felt good after sitting in the wagon all day, and she found herself relaxing slightly as the stars began appearing overhead. "Tomorrow we'll reach Miller's trading post," Mr. Barrett said as they settled down for the night. "Day after that, you'll see your new home." Home. The word felt strange in her mouth, like speaking a foreign language. Could a place become home when you'd been sold into it like livestock? Could people become family when money had changed hands first? As Margaret lay wrapped in her grandmother's quilt, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, she thought about the river rock Jake had given her. She rolled it between her fingers, feeling its smooth surface worn soft by countless years of water and weather. Maybe that's what she needed to do, let this new life wear away her sharp edges until she fit better into whatever shape was required. But deep in her heart, a small voice whispered that she was worth more than 30 silver coins, worth more than just being useful. That voice sounded remarkably like her grandmother, and Margaret held on to it like a lifeline as sleep finally claimed her under the vast Wyoming sky. Tomorrow would bring her closer to whatever future awaited at the Circle B Ranch. But tonight, she was suspended between her old life and her new one, carried forward by hope and fear in equal measure. A blood-curdling scream pierced the morning air, followed by the thundering of hooves that shook the ground beneath Margaret's feet. She pressed herself against the wagon as 3 wild horses burst from the corral, their eyes white with terror, racing toward the open range like demons fleeing judgment. "Easy there, boys," shouted a ranch hand, his rope spinning overhead as he chased after the spooked animals. "Someone left the gate open again." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the chaos unfold before her. The Circle B Ranch sprawled across the valley like a small town, But unlike the quiet streets of Cheyenne, this place pulsed with constant motion and barely controlled wildness. Cowboys ran in every direction, their boots pounding the dusty earth as they worked to round up the escaped horses. "Don't mind the excitement," said a warm voice behind her. "Happens about once a week around here." Margaret turned to find a woman in her 40s, wearing a simple blue dress covered by a practical apron. Her brown hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes held the kind of patience that came from years of dealing with both stubborn cattle and stubborn men. "You must be Margaret," the woman continued, extending a flour-dusted hand. "I'm Elizabeth Barrett, but everyone calls me Mrs. Barrett. Welcome to our little piece of heaven and chaos." The main house stood 2 stories tall, built from thick logs that had weathered countless storms. Unlike her family's cramped cabin, this home felt solid and permanent, as if it had grown from the earth itself. Mrs. Barrett led her up the wooden steps, past chairs that looked comfortable enough for long evening conversations. "My husband Thomas handles the business side of things," Mrs. Barrett explained as they walked through the front door. "But I run the house, and that's where you'll be working with me." The inside took Margaret's breath away. The main room stretched wider than her old home's entire length, with a stone fireplace big enough to roast a whole pig. Comfortable chairs surrounded a large wooden table, and sunlight streamed through clean windows, making everything glow like gold. "This will be your domain," Mrs. Barrett said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Cooking for 12 hungry men 3 times a day, plus whatever visitors might drop by. Think you can handle that?" Margaret nodded, though her stomach fluttered with nervous butterflies. She had cooked for her family of 5, but 12 grown men who worked hard all day would eat far more than anything she had ever prepared. Mrs. Barrett seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't worry, dear. I'll teach you everything you need to know. The men aren't picky eaters, and they're grateful for anything that tastes better than their own cooking." They climbed a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor, where Mrs. Barrett showed her a small room tucked under the slanted roof. A single bed sat beneath a window that looked out over the entire valley, and a simple wooden chest waited for her few belongings. "It's not much," Mrs. Barrett said gently, "but it's yours. Privacy is precious out here, and everyone respects a closed door." Margaret unpacked her things slowly, placing her father's worn Bible on the small table beside her bed. When she pulled out her grandmother's silver thimble, Mrs. Barrett's eyes lit up with recognition. "My grandmother had one just like that," she said softly. "Used it every day, until her fingers got too stiff to sew. Those old thimbles were made to last forever." "She gave it to me before she died," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said it would bring me good luck." Mrs. Barrett smiled. "Smart woman. Your grandmother. Sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest magic." As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Barrett showed Margaret around the rest of the ranch. The barn stood large enough to house 30 horses, its loft filled with sweet-smelling hay that would feed the animals through the long winter months. Chickens pecked and squawked in their fenced yard, while a few milk cows grazed peacefully in a nearby pasture. "The bunkhouse is where most of the men sleep," Mrs. Barrett explained, pointing to a long, low building with smoke curling from its chimney. "They're good men, but they work hard and play harder. They'll respect you if you respect them, but don't take any nonsense from anyone." Margaret noticed several men watching them from a distance, their faces curious but not unfriendly. She had learned to spot the quick look that judged her appearance, but these men seemed more interested in getting back to their work than studying her face. "Supper's at 6 sharp," Mrs. Barrett continued. "The men come in hungry enough to eat a whole cow, so we'll need to start cooking by 4. Think you're ready for your first meal?" Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she nodded. Cooking for 12 strangers felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, but Mrs. Barrett's confident smile gave her courage. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the ranch hands returning from their day's work. Their voices carried across the yard, calling to each other about cattle and horses, repairs that needed doing, and plans for tomorrow. For the first time since leaving home, Margaret felt something other than sadness. This place hummed with purpose and belonging, where everyone had a job that mattered and people who counted on them. Maybe, just maybe, she could find her place here too. But as she turned back to help Mrs. Barrett prepare supper, Margaret caught sight of a lone rider on the horizon, sitting still as a statue as he watched the ranch. Something about his motionless figure sent a chill down her spine, though she couldn't say why. The rider disappeared behind a hill before she could point him out to Mrs. Barrett, leaving Margaret to wonder if she had imagined the whole thing. But the uneasy feeling remained, like a shadow that follows you even when you can't see it. What secrets was this beautiful valley hiding, and why did she feel like someone was watching her every move? Margaret dropped the entire pot of beans, sending them scattering across the kitchen floor like brown pebbles, when the most beautiful voice she had ever heard began singing just outside the window. The song floated through the morning air, a gentle melody about home and heartache that made her chest ache with longing. She had been preparing breakfast in the pre-dawn darkness when the singing started, and now she found herself frozen by the stove, listening to words that seemed to speak directly to her soul. "That's steady," Mrs. Barrett said with a knowing smile, appearing in the doorway with an armload of fresh eggs. "James Morrison, though nobody calls him anything but steady. Best hand with horses I've ever seen, and he's got a voice that could charm angels down from heaven." Margaret quickly knelt to gather the scattered beans, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Barrett. I don't know what came over me." "Don't you worry about a mess that can be cleaned up in 2 minutes," Mrs. Barrett replied, setting down the eggs and helping to collect the wayward beans. "But that voice has been known to stop grown men in their tracks. You're not the first person to get distracted by steady singing." Through the window, Margaret caught her first glimpse of the man behind the voice. He stood near the corral, brushing down a magnificent black horse while he sang. His movements were gentle and sure, and the horse stood perfectly still, as if the animal understood that something magical was happening. James Morrison was not the most handsome man Margaret had ever seen, but something about him drew her attention like a moth to flame. His brown hair caught the early sunlight, and when he smiled at something the horse did, his whole face lit up with joy. He wore simple work clothes that had seen better days, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. "He's been here 3 years now," Mrs. Barrett continued, watching Margaret's face with interest. "Came up from Texas after his family's ranch failed. Never talks much about his past, but his work speaks for itself. The horses trust him like they trust no one else." Margaret tried to focus on cleaning up the beans, but her eyes kept drifting back to the window. Steady had moved on to a different horse now, a nervous gray mare that danced sideways every time he approached. But instead of forcing the animal to submit, he simply stood still and continued singing, letting the mare come to him in her own time. "Watch this," Mrs. Barrett whispered, moving to stand beside Margaret at the window. The gray mare took one tentative step toward Steady, then another. His voice never changed, never pushed, just continued that gentle melody that seemed to calm every living thing within hearing distance. Finally, the mare stretched out her neck and touched his hand with her soft nose, accepting his presence like a gift. "I've never seen anything like that," Margaret breathed, completely forgetting about the beans scattered around her feet. "Steady has a gift, Mrs." Barrett agreed. "Animals sense something in him that makes them feel safe. People, too, for that matter. He's got a way of seeing the good in everyone and everything." As if summoned by their conversation, Steady looked up from the horse and spotted them in the kitchen window. Margaret's heart nearly stopped when he raised his hand in a friendly wave, his smile as warm as summer sunshine. She ducked below the window frame, her face burning with mortification. Mrs. Barrett chuckled softly. "He's not going to bite you, dear. Steady's about as dangerous as a baby lamb." "I know," Margaret mumbled, still crouched below the window. I'm not good with people looking at me." "Well, you're going to have to get used to it," Mrs. Barrett said gently but firmly. "This is a working ranch, and we all depend on each other. Can't do that if you're hiding from everyone." Margaret forced herself to stand up and look out the window again. Steady had returned to his work with the horses, but she could still hear him humming softly. The sound made something flutter in her chest, a feeling she had never experienced before. "Why do they call him Steady?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Mrs. Barrett smiled. "Because that's exactly what he is. Never gets rattled, never loses his temper, never quits when things get tough. When the winter storms hit and the cattle scatter, Steady's the one who rides out in the worst weather to bring them home. When a horse gets spooked and throws its rider, Steady's the one who climbs back on without a second thought." The kitchen door opened with a bang, making both women jump. A young cowboy stumbled in, his hat askew and his shirt torn at the shoulder. "Mrs. Barrett," he gasped, trying to catch his breath. "We've got trouble at the north pasture. 3 of the yearlings are missing, and we found fresh horse tracks that don't belong to any of our mounts." Margaret watched Mrs. Barrett's face change from concern to grim determination. "Rustlers?" "Looks like it, ma'am. Mr. Barrett sent me to tell you, and to ask if Steady could come help track them. He's the best tracker we've got." "Of course," Mrs. Barrett replied immediately. "Margaret, I'm afraid you'll have to handle breakfast on your own this morning. Can you manage?" Margaret's stomach clenched with nervousness, but she nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "How many men will be staying?" "Just 4 or 5. The rest will be riding out with the tracking party." Mrs. Barrett was already untying her apron, her movements quick and efficient. "There's bacon in the smokehouse, eggs from this morning's collection, and bread from yesterday. Keep it simple." As Mrs. Barrett hurried out to help organize the search party, Margaret found herself alone in the kitchen for the first time. Through the window, she watched as men saddled their horses with urgent efficiency. Steady appeared among them, no longer singing but moving with the same calm confidence she had observed earlier. To her surprise, he looked toward the kitchen window and caught her watching. This time, she didn't duck away. Instead, she found herself raising her hand in a small wave, her heart pounding as he touched the brim of his hat in response. Then he was mounting his horse, a powerful chestnut stallion that pranced with eagerness to be off. The tracking party rode out in a thunder of hooves, leaving behind a cloud of dust and an unusual quiet that settled over the ranch like a blanket. Margaret turned back to the stove, her hands shaking slightly, as she began preparing breakfast for the men who remained. But as she worked, she found herself humming the melody Steady had been singing, the words echoing in her mind like a promise of something beautiful yet to come. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. And somewhere in the distance, a group of brave men rode toward danger, led by a cowboy whose steady heart had already begun to change Margaret's world in ways she didn't yet understand. What would happen when he returned? And would she find the courage to let him see the person she kept hidden behind her fears? The bucket slipped from Margaret's hands and crashed to the ground, sending water splashing across her boots and the barn floor. She had been watching Steady work with a wild horse, and seeing his gentle way with a frightened animal made her forget everything else around her. "Easy there," Steady called out. But he wasn't talking to the horse. He was looking at Margaret with those warm eyes that always made her feel like the most important person in the world. That bucket didn't do anything wrong. Margaret felt her face turn red. She had been working at the ranch for over a month now, but Steady still made her feel nervous in the best possible way. Every morning when she saw him walking toward the house for breakfast, her heart would start beating faster like a bird trying to escape from a cage. "The horse is so beautiful," she said, bending down to pick up the bucket. The mare stood in the corral, black as midnight, with a white star on her forehead that looked like someone had touched her with magic. "She is," Steady agreed, walking over to Margaret. "But she's scared of people. Been hurt before, I think. Sometimes it takes a long time to trust again." The way he said it made Margaret think he wasn't just talking about the horse. She had learned that Steady had a way of saying things that meant more than the words themselves. It was like he could see inside people's hearts and understand things they hadn't even told him. "Would you like to help me with her?" he asked. "I could use someone with gentle hands." Margaret almost laughed. Her mother had always said her hands were too big, too rough from work. But when Steady said gentle hands, she believed him. When he looked at her, she saw herself differently. They spent the next hour working with the mare. Steady showed Margaret how to move slowly, how to let the horse smell her first, how to speak in a soft voice that wouldn't frighten her. When the mare finally let Margaret touch her neck, the feeling was better than Christmas morning. "You're a natural," Steady said, and Margaret felt proud in a way she had never experienced before. As the days passed, Margaret found herself looking forward to these moments with Steady and the animals. He taught her about the different horses, how each one had its own personality, just like people did. There was Thunder, who loved to show off, Bell, who was sweet but lazy, and Ranger, who was smart enough to open gate latches with his teeth. One afternoon, while they were fixing a broken fence together, Steady asked her something that surprised her. "Do you ever think about your family back home?" Margaret's hammer stopped in mid-swing. She had been trying not to think about her mother and the way things had ended. "Sometimes," she said quietly. "Do you miss them?" She thought about this question for a long time. "I miss what I thought we had," she finally said, "but I don't think it was ever really there." Steady nodded like he understood exactly what she meant. Sometimes the family we choose is more real than the one we're born into. That evening, Margaret sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that didn't have names. Mrs. Barrett came out and sat beside her, bringing 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cool air. "You seem different," Mrs. Barrett said. "Happier, maybe?" Margaret thought about this. Was she happier? She realized that she had stopped checking her reflection in windows, stopped worrying about how her hair looked or whether her dress was pretty enough. Instead, she found herself thinking about other things, like whether the chickens had enough feed, or if the garden needed watering, or what Steady might want to talk about during their evening walks. "I think I'm starting to remember who I am," Margaret said. Mrs. Barrett smiled. "And who is that?" "Someone who's worth something," Margaret answered, surprised by her own words. The next morning brought a surprise that would change everything. Margaret was hanging clothes on the line when she heard hoofbeats coming fast toward the ranch. A rider appeared over the hill, pushing his horse hard. Even from a distance, Margaret could see that something was wrong. The rider turned out to be Jake Peterson from the neighboring ranch. His face was red from riding hard, and his horse was covered in sweat. "Barrett!" he called out as he jumped down from his saddle. "We got trouble heading this way." Mr. Barrett came running from the barn, with Steady close behind him. Margaret found herself moving closer, even though she knew she probably shouldn't listen to men's business. "The Dawson brothers," Jake said, breathing hard. "They hit the Morrison place last night, took 20 head of cattle and burned down the barn. Sheriff says they're moving this direction." Margaret had heard stories about the Dawson gang. They were men who took what they wanted and hurt anyone who tried to stop them. The thought of them coming to the Circle B made her stomach feel sick. "How many are there?" Mr. Barrett asked. 5, maybe 6. They're armed, and they don't care who gets hurt." Steady's face had gone hard as stone. Margaret had never seen him look like this before. "How far out are they?" "Could be here by tomorrow, maybe sooner if they ride through the night." Margaret felt a cold fear creep up her spine. She had just started to feel safe, to feel like she belonged somewhere. Now danger was coming to destroy it all. But as she watched Steady and Mr. Barrett making plans to protect the ranch, she realized something important. For the first time in her life, she had something worth fighting for. She had people who cared about her, work that mattered, and a place where she belonged. Whatever happened next, she wasn't going to run away. "Get inside the house and stay there," Steady told Margaret, his voice harder than she had ever heard it before. But Margaret shook her head, crossing her arms in a way that meant she wasn't moving. "This is my home too," she said. "I'm not hiding while you fight for it." The Dawson brothers had arrived at dawn, 6 men on horseback who looked like trouble dressed in dirty clothes and mean smiles. They sat just outside the ranch gate, close enough to be threatening but far enough away to avoid the rifles that Mr. Barrett and his men were carrying. "Barrett!" one of them called out. He was a big man with a beard that hadn't been washed in weeks. "We hear you got some fine cattle here. Thought we might take a look." "You thought wrong," Mr. Barrett shouted back. "This is private property. You best move along." The man laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Now that ain't very friendly. We're just passing through. Need some supplies for the road." Margaret watched from the kitchen window, her heart beating so fast she thought it might jump right out of her chest. Mrs. Barrett stood beside her, holding a shotgun like she knew how to use it. 20 years on this frontier," Mrs. Barrett said quietly, "and I've never let outlaws take what we've worked for. I'm not starting today." Outside, Steady and the other ranch hands had spread out, using the barn and corral fence for cover. Margaret could see that they were outnumbered, but they knew the ranch better than the strangers did. "Last chance, Barrett," the bearded man called. "Send out some cattle, and nobody gets hurt." "Go to hell," Mr. Barrett replied. That's when the shooting started. Margaret had never heard gunfire before, and the loud banging made her jump. She watched Steady duck behind a water trough as bullets hit the wood above his head. One of the Dawson men was trying to circle around toward the barn, but Tommy, the youngest ranch hand, was ready for him. "I have to help," Margaret said, but Mrs. Barrett grabbed her arm. "The best way to help is to stay alive," the older woman said. "They'll try to use you against the men if they catch you." But Margaret was thinking about something else. She remembered the old Indian trail that ran behind the house, the one Steady had shown her during their walks. It led up to the ridge where someone could see the whole ranch. If the Dawson men knew about it, they could attack from behind. "I'll be right back," Margaret said, and before Mrs. Barrett could stop her, she slipped out the back door. The trail was steep and rocky, but Margaret climbed it as fast as she could. Her dress kept catching on thorns, and her boots slipped on loose stones, but she didn't slow down. Behind her, the gunfight continued, the sounds echoing off the canyon walls. When she reached the ridge, she saw exactly what she had feared. 2 of the Dawson men were climbing up the other side, planning to attack the ranch from above. They hadn't seen her yet, but they would soon. Margaret looked around desperately for something to help her. The ridge was covered with loose rocks, some as big as her head. An idea began to form. Dangerous, but maybe it would work. She started rolling rocks to the edge of the cliff, right above where the men were climbing. When she had gathered enough, she took a deep breath and pushed them all over at once. The rock slide sounded like thunder. The 2 men looked up just in time to see stones bouncing down toward them. They scrambled to get out of the way, but the rocks knocked one of them off the narrow trail. He fell into a bush below, cursing loud enough for everyone to hear. The other man made it to safety, but now he was angry. He spotted Margaret on the ridge and started climbing toward her, his gun in his hand. "You little wildcat," he snarled. "You're going to pay for that." Margaret ran. She had never been so scared in her life, but she had also never felt so alive. She was protecting her home, her family, the man she was beginning to love. Her feet flew over the rocky ground as she headed back toward the ranch. The man chasing her was bigger and stronger, but Margaret knew the land better. She led him through thick bushes that caught at his clothes and over rocks that made him stumble. All the time, she could hear him getting closer, breathing hard and saying words that would have made her mother wash his mouth out with soap. When Margaret burst out of the trees near the barn, Steady saw her immediately. He also saw the man chasing her, gun raised and ready to shoot. What happened next would be talked about for years in the saloons and general stores of Wyoming Territory. Steady's rifle shot was so perfect that it knocked the gun right out of the outlaw's hand without hurting him. The man stopped running and put his hands up, suddenly realizing he was surrounded by very angry ranch hands. The fight was over. The other Dawson men, seeing their plan had failed and half their group was captured, decided to ride away rather than face the sheriff who was already on his way. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing a meal that tasted better than any fancy restaurant food, Margaret felt something she had never experienced before. She felt like a hero. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," Steady told her, his eyes shining with admiration. "You saved us all." Margaret looked around the table at the faces of people who had become her family. Mrs. Barrett smiled at her with pride. Mr. Barrett nodded his approval. The ranch hands looked at her with new respect. For the first time in her life, Margaret understood what it meant to be beautiful. It had nothing to do with her face or her hair or her clothes. It had everything to do with courage, loyalty, and the willingness to fight for the people you love. She was beautiful because she was brave, and finally, she was beginning to believe it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning when the snow fell like angry tears from a gray sky. Margaret found it waiting on the kitchen table, her name written in her mother's careful handwriting. Her hands shook as she picked up the envelope, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. I'm sorry to interrupt you right here, but if you're enjoying this story thus far, please consider to subscribe to our channel so that you can enjoy so many more in the future. And by the way, don't hesitate to like the video as well, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now enjoy the rest of the story. Bad news? Steady asked, stepping through the kitchen door with snow melting on his shoulders. He carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, the smell filling the warm room. I don't know yet, Margaret whispered. The paper felt heavy in her hands, like it carried more than just words. It's from my mother. Steady set down the coffee cups and pulled out a chair for her. Want me to stay while you read it? Margaret nodded, grateful for his quiet presence. She opened the letter slowly, afraid of what she might find inside. Her mother's words were neat and careful, just like always. My dear Margaret, the letter began, I hope this finds you well. Much has changed since you left us. Your sister Sarah married the banker's son last month. The wedding was beautiful, with white roses and a dress that cost more than we used to make in a year. Your brother found work at the new mill, and the pay is better than we ever dreamed. Margaret's heart started beating faster. She could feel where this was going. We have been blessed with good fortune. The debts are paid, and we even have money saved. I find myself thinking of you often, wondering if perhaps I made a mistake. There might be room for you here now, if you have learned to make something better of yourself. The words hit Margaret like a slap. Even now, even when offering to take her back, her mother couldn't just say she missed her. She had to add that part about making something better of herself. What does she say? Steady asked gently. Margaret read him the letter, her voice getting smaller with each word. When she finished, tears were running down her cheeks. She wants me to come home, but only if I've changed enough to deserve it. Steady was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind howled around the house like a lonely animal. Finally, he reached across the table and took her hand. What do you want to do? He asked. I don't know, Margaret said honestly. Part of me wants to go back, to show her that I'm worth something now. But another part of me. She stopped, not sure how to put her feelings into words. Another part of you knows you are always worth something, Steady finished quietly. Margaret looked up at him, surprised. How did you know? Because I see it every day, he said. The way you take care of everyone on this ranch. The way you stand up for what's right. The way you smile when you think no one is watching. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. But Margaret wasn't so sure. That night, she lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about home. She remembered her sister Sarah, always perfect and pretty. She remembered her brother Tom, strong and smart and everything a son should be. Then she thought about herself, the daughter who was never quite enough. The next morning brought more snow and a surprise visitor. Mrs. Henderson from town rode up to the house, her face red from the cold. "Margaret," she called out, "I have news from Cheyenne. Your sister's wedding was in the newspaper. Look." Mrs. Henderson pulled out a folded paper and showed Margaret the announcement. There was Sarah's name in fancy letters, along with a long list of important people who attended the wedding. At the bottom, in small print, it mentioned the bride's family. Margaret's name wasn't there at all. "They left me out," Margaret said, staring at the paper, "like I never existed." Mrs. Henderson's face grew sad. "Oh dear, I'm sorry. I thought you'd want to know." After Mrs. Henderson left, Margaret sat by the kitchen window, watching the snow fall. She thought about the newspaper announcement, about her mother's letter, about all the ways her family had made her feel invisible. Steady found her there an hour later, still staring out at the white world. "You're thinking about going back," he said. It wasn't a question. "Maybe," Margaret admitted. "What if this is my chance to finally belong somewhere?" "You already belong somewhere," Steady said, sitting down beside her. "You belong here, with people who see you for who you really are." Margaret turned to look at him. His eyes were warm and honest, like always. "But what if I'm making a mistake? What if I should go home and try to be the daughter they want? What if you stayed and kept being the woman you are?" Steady asked back. That evening, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen. She started 3 different letters to her mother but couldn't finish any of them. How do you tell someone that their love isn't enough when it comes with so many conditions? Finally, she folded her mother's letter and put it in her pocket. Tomorrow, she would have to decide. But tonight, she just wanted to sit by the fire and think about who she really was and who she wanted to become. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the world in white. It reminded Margaret of starting over, of clean slates and new beginnings. But she was beginning to understand that sometimes the best new beginning was learning to love the life you already had. The trouble started before dawn, when Margaret heard horses moving fast across the frozen ground. She jumped out of bed and ran to her window, but in the gray morning light, she could only see dark shapes disappearing toward the eastern hills. Something was wrong. Margaret dressed quickly and ran downstairs to find Mrs. Barrett already in the kitchen, her face pale with worry. "The men went out early to check the cattle," Mrs. Barrett said, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "But I heard gunshots about an hour ago. That's never a good sign." Margaret's heart started racing. "Where's Steady?" "He rode out with the others. They should have been back by now." Mrs. Barrett's hands shook as she poured coffee. "I keep thinking about those Dawson brothers. They've been causing trouble at other ranches." The Dawson brothers were a group of men who moved from ranch to ranch, pretending to look for work. But wherever they went, cattle disappeared, and good men got hurt. Everyone in the territory knew to watch out for them. "Maybe I should ride out and look for them," Margaret said. "Absolutely not," Mrs. Barrett said firmly. "If there's trouble, the last thing we need is more people in danger." But as the morning stretched on with no sign of the men, Margaret couldn't sit still. She kept thinking about Steady, about his kind eyes and gentle hands. What if something had happened to him? What if the Dawson brothers had hurt him? Around noon, a single horse came galloping up to the house. Margaret's heart jumped with hope, but it wasn't Steady. It was Jake Miller, one of the younger ranch hands, and his face was dark with anger and fear. "They got Steady and Mr. Barrett," Jake said, jumping down from his horse. "The Dawsons ambushed them up by Eagle Creek. They're holding them hostage while they round up our best cattle." Margaret felt like the world had stopped spinning. "Are they hurt?" "I don't know," Jake said honestly. "But Pete Dawson said if anyone follows them, they'll shoot both men. They're heading for the border, planning to sell our cattle and disappear." Mrs. Barrett sank into a chair, her face white as snow. "What do? We can't fight them. There are too many of them, and they have guns." But Margaret's mind was already working. She thought about the letter in her pocket, about her mother's conditional love, about all the times she'd been told she wasn't brave enough, or smart enough, or good enough. Well, maybe it was time to prove everyone wrong. I have an idea, she said quietly. That afternoon, Margaret rode alone toward Eagle Creek, her heart pounding like thunder. She carried no weapons except her sharp mind and fierce determination. The plan she'd made was dangerous, but it was the only chance they had. She found the Dawson camp just as the sun started sinking toward the western mountains. They had chosen a spot by the creek, with good grass for the stolen cattle and plenty of cover from the rocks and trees. Margaret could see Steady and Mr. Barrett tied up near the fire, both men looking tired but alive. Pete Dawson was the youngest and meanest of the brothers. He sat by the fire, cleaning his gun and laughing at something his older brother had said. Margaret took a deep breath and rode straight into their camp. "Well, well," Pete said, standing up with a nasty grin. "Look what we have here, if it isn't the ugly little ranch girl." "I came to make a deal," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. Pete laughed. "A deal? What could you possibly offer us?" "Information," Margaret said, "about where Mr. Barrett keeps his money, and about the army patrol that's coming through tomorrow." This was a lie, but Pete didn't know that. His eyes got interested and greedy. "Keep talking," he said. Margaret climbed down from her horse, acting nervous and scared. It wasn't hard to pretend. Her knees were shaking so badly she could barely stand. But she had learned something important over the past months. Sometimes being underestimated was the best weapon you could have. "Mr. Barrett doesn't trust banks," she said, speaking just loud enough for the brothers to hear. "He keeps his money hidden in the house. I know where." "And why would you tell us that?" asked Tom Dawson, the oldest brother. He was smarter than Pete and more suspicious. "Because I want to come with you," Margaret said. "I'm tired of working like a slave for people who don't appreciate me. I want my share of whatever you get." Pete laughed again. "You? A pretty little thing like you wants to ride with outlaws?" The word pretty hit Margaret like a surprise. Pete was making fun of her, calling her the opposite of what he really thought. But for the first time, his insult didn't hurt. She knew what she looked like, and she knew it didn't matter. What mattered was saving the people she loved. "I'm not as helpless as I look," Margaret said, and this time she wasn't pretending to be brave. The brothers talked among themselves for a few minutes. Margaret could see Steady watching her from across the camp, his eyes full of worry and something that might have been pride. Finally, Pete walked over to her. "All right, ugly girl. You can show us where the money is, but if you're lying, you'll regret it." Margaret nodded, her heart racing. The hard part was just beginning. As night fell over the Wyoming Territory, Margaret sat by the outlaws' fire, playing her dangerous game. She answered their questions carefully, spinning a web of lies mixed with just enough truth to keep them interested. And all the while, she watched and waited for her chance to turn the tables on men who thought a plain ranch girl couldn't possibly outsmart them. The silver thimble in her pocket caught the firelight as she moved, reminding her of her grandmother's words about hearts that dare to love. Tonight, Margaret would find out just how much her heart was willing to dare. The town blacksmith stopped his hammering when Margaret walked by. For the first time in her life, a man had paused his work just to tip his hat at her with respect. Word of how she'd knocked Pete Dawson flat with a skillet had spread faster than wildfire across the Wyoming Territory, and suddenly everyone wanted to hear the story from the girl who'd stood her ground. "Miss Margaret," called out Mrs. Henderson from the bakery, "I saved you some fresh bread. Heard you've been keeping busy protecting the ranch." Margaret smiled and accepted the warm loaf, still amazed that people were treating her like someone important. 3 weeks had passed since the Dawson brothers tried to steal cattle, and each day brought new surprises. Yesterday, the judge's wife had asked for her advice about dealing with troublesome men. Today, the preacher's daughter wanted to know how she'd found such courage. But the biggest change wasn't how others saw her. Standing in front of her bedroom mirror each morning, Margaret noticed something different in her own eyes. They held a spark that hadn't been there before, like a candle finally lit in a dark room. Back at the ranch, she found Steady repairing fence posts near the creek. He looked up when she approached, and that warm smile spread across his face like sunshine after rain. "How was town?" he asked, setting down his hammer. "Strange," Margaret admitted. "People keep calling me brave. I just hit someone with a pan because he was being mean." Steady laughed, a sound that made her heart skip. Sometimes being brave is that simple. You saw something wrong and you fixed it. They worked together in comfortable quiet, Margaret holding the fence boards while Steady nailed them in place. Her hands had grown strong from months of ranch work, and she no longer worried about calluses or dirt under her fingernails. These hands had fought off a cattle thief. They deserved to show their work. "Margaret," Steady said suddenly, "there's something I need to tell you." Her stomach fluttered. The serious tone in his voice was new. "I got a letter yesterday from my brother in Colorado. He's offering me a job managing his ranch. Good pay, nice house, chance to build something of my own." Margaret's heart sank like a stone in deep water. "That sounds wonderful for you." "It would be," Steady said carefully, "if I wanted to go alone." The words hung in the air between them like morning mist. Margaret looked up to find his honey-colored eyes watching her intently. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying I don't want to go anywhere without you. I'm saying I've been thinking about this every day for months. I'm saying—" He took a deep breath. "Margaret Rose Sinclair, would you consider marrying me?" The hammer slipped from her fingers and hit the ground with a thud. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. No one had ever wanted to build a life with her. Her own mother had been eager to get rid of her. "But I'm not pretty," she said automatically, the old words rising from deep habit. Steady reached out and gently touched her cheek. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever known. You're brave and kind and strong. You read poetry and stand up to bullies and make the best biscuits in Wyoming. You're beautiful in ways that matter." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but for once they weren't tears of sadness. These were tears of recognition, of finally being seen for who she really was. "Yes," she said, the word coming out like a song. "Yes, I'll marry you." Steady whooped and picked her up, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with joy. "There's just one thing," Margaret said, suddenly remembering. "I got another letter from my mother yesterday. She wants me to come home. Says they have money now and there might be a place for me." Steady's expression grew serious. "What do you want to do?" Margaret thought about her mother's letter, still sitting unopened on her dresser. For weeks, she'd been afraid to read it, worried it might pull her back into old feelings of worthlessness. But now, standing here with Steady's proposal warm in her heart, she realized something important. "I want to read it," she said, "but not because I'm thinking of leaving, because I need to see how much I've changed." That evening, Margaret sat on her bed with the letter in her hands. Steady waited downstairs, giving her privacy for this moment. With steady fingers, she opened the envelope and read her mother's words. The letter was full of apologies and excuses. Her mother wrote about hard times and difficult choices. She promised that things would be different now, that Margaret could come home and find a suitable husband from their improved social circle. But as Margaret read, she felt something unexpected: pity. Her mother still believed that a woman's worth came from her husband's status and society's approval. She had no idea that real beauty came from courage, kindness, and self-respect. Margaret folded the letter and placed it in her hope chest beside her grandmother's pressed flower. Then she went downstairs to find Steady waiting by the fireplace. "Well?" he asked gently. "I'm exactly where I belong," Margaret said, settling beside him on the wooden bench. "My mother offered me a place in her world, but I've already found my place in mine." Steady took her hand, and Margaret marveled at how perfectly their fingers fit together. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the cottonwood trees, and somewhere in that ancient song, she heard her grandmother's voice whispering that love always finds a way to bloom, even in the most unlikely soil. The morning of Margaret's wedding dawned clear and bright, with autumn painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and blue. But Margaret wasn't thinking about the weather as she stood in her small room, staring at the dress hanging on her wardrobe door. Her grandmother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her taller frame, seemed to glow in the early sunlight like a promise waiting to be kept. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Margaret? May I come in?" Mrs. Barrett's gentle voice called through the door. "Of course," Margaret replied, smoothing her hair nervously. Mrs. Barrett entered, carrying a small wooden box and wearing the kind of smile that mothers save for their daughters' wedding days. Over the past year, she had become more than an employer to Margaret. She had become the mother Margaret had always needed. "I have something for you," Mrs. Barrett said, setting the box on the bed. "These belong to my grandmother. She always said they should go to a bride who understood the real meaning of marriage." Inside the box lay a string of pearls, simple but elegant, with a soft luster that spoke of years of love and care. Margaret gasped. "Mrs. Barrett, I couldn't possibly." "Nonsense," the older woman said firmly. "My grandmother would have loved you. She always said the most beautiful brides were the ones who married for love, not convenience." As Mrs. Barrett fastened the pearls around Margaret's neck, Margaret thought about all the women who had worn them before. Each one had probably stood before a mirror on her wedding day, hoping for happiness and love. Today, Margaret was the latest link in that chain of hope. Downstairs, the ranch bustled with activity. The men had cleared the main yard and set up wooden benches for guests. Mrs. Henderson from town had arrived early with her famous cake, and the smell of roasting beef drifted from the outdoor fire pit. Even the horses seemed to sense something special was happening, prancing in their pasture with unusual energy. In the barn, Steady paced nervously, while Tom Barrett helped him adjust his string tie for the third time. "Stop fidgeting," Tom laughed. "She already said yes. The hard part's over." "What if she changes her mind?" Steady worried aloud. "What if she decides she wants to go back to her family after all?" Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "Son, I've watched that girl bloom like a wildflower over the past year. She's not going anywhere except down that aisle to you." Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Margaret sat still as a statue, while Mrs. Barrett arranged wildflowers in her hair. Autumn asters and goldenrod created a crown of purple and yellow that brought out the copper highlights in her auburn locks. "There," Mrs. Barrett said, stepping back to admire her work. "Perfect." Margaret looked in the mirror and saw a bride she barely recognized, not because she looked different, but because she looked like herself for the first time in her life. The face staring back at her belonged to a woman who knew her own worth, who had fought for what mattered, and who was ready to build a life based on love instead of fear. A commotion outside drew their attention to the window. Riders were approaching from the east, kicking up dust clouds in their haste. Margaret's heart jumped, wondering if trouble had found them even on her wedding day. But as the riders got closer, Margaret recognized the lead horse and its rider. Her breath caught in her throat. "It's my brother," she whispered. "That's Samuel." Mrs. Barrett squeezed her hand. "Did you invite him?" "No," Margaret said, confused. "He doesn't even know about the wedding." Samuel dismounted and strode toward the house, his face grim with purpose. Behind him came two other men Margaret didn't recognize, their clothes dusty from hard travel. Margaret met them on the front porch, Mrs. Barrett close behind her. Samuel stopped short when he saw her, his eyes widening in surprise. "Margaret? Lord, you look—" He paused, seeming to struggle for words. "You look happy." "I am happy," Margaret said carefully. "Samuel, what are you doing here?" "Mother sent me," he said, then glanced around at the wedding preparations with growing understanding. "She got word about some trouble with cattle thieves and wanted to make sure you were safe. But it looks like we're interrupting something important." Before Margaret could respond, Steady appeared at her side, his presence calm and protective. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he took in the cowboy's obvious devotion to his sister. "You must be the man who's been taking care of Margaret," Samuel said, extending his hand. "I'm Samuel Sinclair, her brother." "James Morrison," Steady replied, shaking hands firmly. "And I haven't been taking care of your sister." She's been taking care of herself quite well." Something in Steady's tone made Samuel look more closely at Margaret. For the first time, he seemed to really see her, not as the awkward girl their mother had sent away, but as the confident woman she'd become. "Margaret," Samuel said slowly, "I owe you an apology. We all do. Mother especially." "It's all right," Margaret began, but Samuel shook his head. "No, it's not. We treated you poorly because we were scared and angry about our own problems." "That was wrong." He paused, looking around at the ranch and the people gathered for the celebration. "But it looks like everything worked out for the best." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears. Her brother's words couldn't erase the past, but they helped heal something that had been broken for too long. "Would you like to stay for the wedding?" she asked. "There's plenty of food, and Mrs. Barrett makes room for everyone." Samuel's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since childhood. "I'd be honored to walk you down the aisle, if you'll have me." An hour later, Margaret stood at the end of the makeshift aisle, her arm linked through Samuel's. The entire ranch community had gathered, cowboys, townspeople, neighbors from miles around. But Margaret only had eyes for Steady, who waited for her beneath an arch of cottonwood branches, his face radiant with joy. As she walked toward her future, Margaret felt her grandmother's silver thimble warm against her finger and heard her father's voice echoing from childhood. "Beauty is as beauty does, my dear girl." Today, surrounded by people who loved her for exactly who she was, Margaret finally understood what those words meant. Beauty wasn't something you were born with or without. It was something you created every day through your choices, your courage, and your capacity to love. When she reached Steady's side and looked into his warm, honey-colored eyes, Margaret knew she had found her home at last. Not in a place, but in the recognition of her own worth, and in the love of a man who had always seen her clearly. The preacher's words washed over them like a blessing, but Margaret was already lost in the wonder of this moment, standing in the Wyoming sunshine, wearing her grandmother's dress and her grandmother's wisdom, ready to begin the greatest adventure of all, a life built on love, respect, and the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly enough, exactly as she was.